Welcome to video number 4 for Chapter 8, America Secedes from the Empire. In this video, we'll focus on the Battle of Yorktown and the end of the war. Yorktown was the final curtain of the American Revolution. One of the darkest periods of the war was 1780 to 1781, before the last decisive victory. The American government was virtually bankrupt. It declared that it would repay debt at only 2.5 cents per dollar. And despair prevailed. The sense of unity was withering, and mutinous sentiments infected the army. Cornwallis blundered into a trap. After futile operations in Virginia, he fell back to the Chesapeake Bay at Yorktown. He awaited seaborne supplies and reinforcements, and assumed that Britain still controlled the seas, but during this period, British naval superiority had slipped away. The French were very important in the Battle of Yorktown. Admiral de Grasse informed the Americans that he could join them against Cornwallis at Yorktown. Washington makes a swift march of 300 miles from New York to the Chesapeake for the battle. He's accompanied by Rochambeau's French army, and Washington besets the British at land, while de Grasse blockaded the sea. This is a sketch of the Battle of the Chesapeake Capes in 1791. This is probably the only depiction of the sea battle by a participant, and this shows the British and French fleets engaged at the Battle of Yorktown. Cornered, Cornwallis surrendered the entire force of 7,000 men on October 19, 1781. George III had planned to continue the struggle. Fighting continued for a year after Yorktown, with the savage Patriot-Loyalist warfare in the South. But Washington's most valuable contributions were to keep the cause alive, the army in the field, and the states together. The aftermath of the war plays out in Paris. Many Britons were very weary of the war, and they had suffered losses additionally in India and the West Indies. The island of Minnekora and the Mediterranean had also fallen, and Lord North's ministry had collapsed in Britain in March of 1782, temporarily ending George III's personal rule. The Whig ministry, who was more favorable to the Americans, replaced the Tory regime of Lord North. American negotiators Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay gathered at Paris. They were instructed to make no separate peace and to consult with French allies at all stages. American representatives chafed under this directive. They knew it had been written by a subservient Congress under pressure from the French Foreign Office. France was also in a difficult position. They had induced Spain to enter the war, and Spain had coveted the immense Trans-Allegheny area in North America, and they desired an independent United States, but wanted to keep the new republic east of the Allegheny Mountains. A weak America would be easier to manage in promoting French interests and policy. So France was paying a heavy price to win America's independence, and she wanted her money's worth. John Jay was unwilling to play the French game, and he secretly made overtures to London. London came to terms with the Americans with a preliminary treaty that was signed in 1782. The formal Treaty of Paris, which ended the war, was signed in 1783. In this treaty, Britain recognized the independence of the United States, and the boundaries of the new nation were set so the United States would stretch to the Mississippi River in the west, to the Great Lakes in the north, and to Spanish Florida in the south. The Yankees retained access to the fisheries of Newfoundland. American concessions were also present in the treaty. The Loyalists were not to be further persecuted, and Congress was to recommend to the states that confiscated Loyalist property be restored to their owners, and that debts owed to British creditors still be paid. British concessions were to accept defeat in North America and to end the war, which would allow England to then rebuild. The British terms were liberal. They granted enormous Trans-Appalachian area States, and in spirit, the Americans made a separate peace, contrary to the French alliance. France was relieved with the end of the costly conflict, and America alone had gained from the world-girdling war. They began a national career with splendid territorial birthright and priceless heritage in North America. This is a political cartoon showing the reconciliation between Britannia, who is representing Great Britain, and her daughter, America, who is represented by Native Americans. Basically, this is where the daughter, which is represented by the United States, is invited to kiss her mother and make up. There is another cartoon from the beginning of the American Revolution, which we saw in class, which illustrated the tensions of this relationship. And this is the chronology